would you mind just kind of explaining I know you talked about, how weeds are a major pest and that we need to, you know, find ways to combat them because they're so prevalent. But for somebody who doesn't have much agricultural experience, could you kind of explain why weeds are such a pest and why they're so important to keep under control?
Yeah, so for most of our field crops, especially, weeds very much compete with the crops. So, like for rice, or for example, with rice, when we don't control weeds in rice, we can actually end up with nothing at the end of the season. So you plant your rice crop, you don't control your weeds at all. If you didn't control them in any way, you can literally end up with no rice at the end of the season. The weeds are so competitive. Different crops, compete differently with weeds. Rice is not very competitive. Um, in fact, a lot of grass crops aren't super competitive. So without managing the weeds, our yields, what we're producing at the end of the season drop by a lot.
Hello and welcome to Talk Ag to Me, the podcast dedicated to improving ag literacy around the globe. I'm your host, Brennan Black, and today's episode is going to be all about agri-science. To help me talk about this topic, I've got Dr. Whitney Brim-DeForest here to talk about her job and what she does in the agri-science field. So I'm going to let her give her own little introduction, talk about what she does a little bit before we hop into the questions here.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Brendan, for having me. So as Brendan said, I'm Whitney Brim-DeForest. My official title is Rice Advisor. I'm based out of a county office with University of California Cooperative Extension. My main crops that I cover are rice and wild rice, and my background is in weed science, so I tend to do a lot of my research in that area. But I do extension, outreach to the growers in all areas, but weeds are really important in rice. So again, mostly that's where I focus.
Awesome. So would you kind of mind just starting out talking about how you got into the extension and kind of what pushed you into the field of agri-science in the first place?
Sure. So I guess I can go way back here. So as an undergrad, I actually was originally interested in music. And then switched majors partway through to biology. And then shortly after I graduated, I joined the Peace Corps. And so it was actually in the Peace Corps that I ended up really focusing in agriculture and in weed science as well. And then after coming back to the States, I started a master's program at University of California, Davis, and then transitioned into a PhD program and stayed in rice. So my PhD program focused in rice and weed science, and then a position opened up here in California, and that's where I've been for about 4 years now as an extension scientist.
Cool. That sounds awesome. So did you have much of an agriculture background before going into the Peace Corps, or was that kind of your first experience?
Well, I was always interested in plants in my family. Some of my extended family are farmers, growers. My great-grandparents owned a farm, and then some of my aunts and uncles have still farm in different parts of the country. And I actually did quite a lot of volunteering on farms throughout college, so I kind of had an idea that I was interested in agriculture before going into the Peace Corps. But the Peace Corps itself was really where I got, I would say, very interested in continuing on in ag, and particularly in extension, actually, as a field.
Awesome. So why don't you just kind of go into a little bit more depth about, if you're able to, about what the extension, does in terms of how you work with growers, what your research is actually based around. I know you said you talked about, weeds and rice and that sort of thing, but what exactly are you guys working on? As much information as you can give on what you guys are working on about, like right now.
Sure. So I don't know how much your audience knows about extension. I actually didn't know that much about it until I started at UC Davis. But extension is a federal program. So it was started roughly about 100 years ago now, as an act of Congress. And it's paired with all the land grant universities across the country, and their extension offices, basically, I wouldn't say necessarily every county, but almost every county across the United States. And I kind of like to think of it as like a way for the community to have access to science and to scientists. So I think it's fairly unique. I don't think there are very many countries in the world that have an extension service like we do here. And I also think it's part of the reason why our agriculture is advanced. Any grower can call any of us up at any time to come out to their fields. And I think it's a really great way to have that scientific knowledge, like basically at your fingertips, in each community. So I work primarily in rice. As I said, most of my research focuses on weed science, but myself and my colleagues that work in rice here in California, there's about 5 of us. We do cover all different aspects of rice production practices. And a lot of our research is based on what is most important and what is most pressing at the time to growers. So I like to think that it's very needs-based. So what the growers are interested in and what they need most is what we tend to do research on and try to do research on.
Upon doing more research on what you do and having you talk about it, I was kind of caught off guard on the whole studying rice thing, because I knew that California grows a lot of different types of crops, so I wasn't familiar with where rice is grown in California, unless it's you're talking about rice that you research for other areas or other countries. Are there California rice growers that I wasn't aware of?
Yeah, so actually rice has been grown in California since I think the first commercial the first commercial growers were in the early 1900s.
Wow.
So yeah, roughly 100 years of commercial rice growing, and there's about 500,000 acres or so in California. And most of the growers that grow rice are actually primarily rice growers. They don't tend to grow other crops. So it's actually a very important cultural crop, I'd say, in this area. Mostly in the Sacramento Valley. So I'm based out of Yuba County and Sutter County, but Yuba, Sutter, Butte, Glen, Colusa, I'm gonna miss a few, some in Sacramento, a little bit in Yolo County, and a little bit in Placer as well. So sort of the northern part of the state. And the area actually was historically, before rice was growing here, was historically wetlands. And so when folks started coming to California to farm, rice seemed like a viable crop for this particular area. And to this day, the rice area provides habitat similar to wetlands for birds, some amphibians. So it's actually sort of the rice is taken over as sort of a pseudo wetlands. So yeah, it's actually a pretty neat agro-ecosystem. I think it's a very good example of an agricultural area that still provides a lot of ecosystem services as well.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly interesting. I actually, like I said, I wasn't really aware that we grew a whole lot of rice in California, but I mean, that does make sense that the northern regions would have more of the wetland style, climate and ecosystem area. I mean, because I'm here down in the Central Valley, so it's all dry here. So
right.
It's a little bit more far-fetched to think of rice growing in this area, but no, that's actually really, really interesting. Do you get a whole lot of, and I know you're more of you're more involved in the scientific and agricultural communities, but do you get a lot of people that aren't from those backgrounds that are curious about what you do, or that, like me, didn't have any awareness about the fact that we even grow rice or have that type of ability to grow those crops here in California?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think most of the time when I say that I work in rice, people are very surprised. I'm actually originally from Oregon, and I will say that I did not know that we grew rice in California either until I moved to California for graduate school. So, and my dad came and visited, I want to say maybe roughly around the time I started working here. And he thought all of the rice fields weren't like were water basins. He was like, look at those reservoirs. And I was like, no, those are the rice fields. So yeah, I think it's very surprising to a lot of people that we grow as much rice as we do. And actually, in terms of rice yields, we're the highest yielding area in the world for rice.
Wow.
So, yeah, actually very important rice growing area as far as rice goes.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah.
That's cool. So I know that, I don't have much knowledge on rice. Most of my knowledge goes into like row crops and livestock operations, but I do know that there was some experimental work being done with rice in terms of genetic modification. I don't know if you have any information on that, or if your branch was working with that at all, but do you know anything more about that?
Sure. So the only GMO rice that has been worked on so far that's made it close to any sort of commercialization is golden rice, actually, from Asia. And I believe I was actually just looking this up a couple days ago to see if it had been approved for eating, and it has, but only in a couple of countries. And so I don't know if they're actually, people are actually consuming it as of yet. But in the U.S., we don't have any GMO rice. The two major rice growing areas are here in California and then in the southeast, and we don't have GMO rice here at all.
Gotcha. Interesting. So you also said that you work a lot with weeds. What exactly do you do with weeds?
So I'm technically, like, my area of research, my title, I guess, is a weed scientist. And there's actually quite a lot of us. So there's national and international societies. There's a California Weed Science Society. Yeah. But so actually, as far as cropping system goes, weeds are really important, right? So weeds are directly competing with our crops for nutrients, for light. So in terms of pests, they're probably the most important pest. I mean, I hate to say that to the entomologists and to the pathologists, but they're very, very important pests. They're always here. There's no way to completely get rid of weeds, right? So it's a sort of like an ongoing thing that we all deal with. We actually apply more herbicides than any other type of pesticide in the U.S. On average per year. In terms of other ways to deal with weeds other than herbicides, most of the labor that we use in ag goes towards weed management. So it's a really it's just one of those ongoing pest areas. And I got into weed science actually because of the labor aspect of it and how much labor and time is put into weed management worldwide. So to me, that was actually why, what drove me to weed science, actually. So
Interesting.
yeah, I know it's not one of those things, though. I will say, people do grow up, as little kids saying, "Oh, I want to be an entomologist or something," but I've yet to hear of anyone wanting to be a weed scientist as a child. So.
It is a very obscure job, but I'm sure it has quite a bit of interesting stuff going on within that career field. So would you mind just kind of explaining what I know you talked about, how weeds are a major pest and that we need to, find ways to combat them because they're so prevalent. But for somebody who doesn't have much agricultural experience, could you kind of explain why weeds are such a pest and why they're so important to keep under control?
Yeah, so for most of our field crops, especially, weeds very much compete with the crops. So like for rice, or for example, with rice, when we don't control weeds in rice, we can actually end up with nothing at the end of the season. So you plant your rice crop, you don't control your weeds at all. If you didn't control them in any way, you can literally end up with no rice at the end of the season. The weeds are so competitive. Different crops, compete differently with weeds. Rice is not very competitive. In fact, a lot of grass crops aren't super competitive. So without managing the weeds, our yields, what we're producing at the end of the season drop by a lot. And so it becomes very important to manage weeds. I mean, I think if people think of their gardens and stuff, you can probably, even on a small scale, think about what weeds do to a garden. They can grow over your plants to the point that they're shading them, they're crowding them out, they're competing for water, for nutrients. And depending on how bad they are and how many weeds you've got, you can end up with nothing.
Yeah.
out of your field or garden. So
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think a decent amount of people understand that concept, but I have met some people that don't understand that it's not just a cosmetic thing to get rid of weeds, that there's actually a purpose from a productive point of view to actually, to try to eradicate them. Because, we've seen
yeah,
concerns with people with the amount of pesticides we use, particularly herbicides, and they don't understand why we get rid of weeds so badly. And I kind of wanted to get a weed scientist point of view on why that's such a big deal.
sure. And like I don't, say that we should be using tons and tons of herbicides, but
Mm-hmm.
they're one tool in our toolbox, right, in terms of weed management.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other things that we do to manage weeds. Like for example, with rice, we actually flood the fields, so the water actually suppresses weeds.
Hmm.
So we don't flood rice because of rice requiring water. It can grow in dry land as well, but we flood it for weed suppression.
Oh,
So
that's interesting.
the weeds can grow as well under super, high water. Yeah, so it's kind of we do a lot of other things to manage weeds as well as use herbicides, but in terms of uh, using pesticides and using herbicides, I think herbicides are a great tool.
Mm-hmm.
Without them, we end up having to have hand labor in a lot of cases. There's just not a way to get the weeds out of the field except for with human hands.
Hmm.
So actually, why I got into weed management in the first place was watching smallholder farmers in West Africa. I was based out of Senegal in the Peace Corps, and watching people literally go out and hand pull weeds out of acres and acres of rice, and then because they weren't timely enough, they weren't pulling the weeds early enough. Out of no fault of their own, it's just not possible in some
Mm-hmm.
instances. They would end up with basically nothing at the end of the season.
Mm.
So they'd spend 3 to 4 months hand weeding and then yield very, very low. And so for me, it sort of started me on that thought process of thinking, this is a really important topic that we don't talk about that much.
Mm.
So the number one use of labor worldwide is actually in weed management.
Wow.
Yeah, so for me, it's a very, it's more than just about managing the weeds. It's also a labor issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So have you seen, I'm assuming, in your field of work, you've had to work with a variety of different types of growers, conventional, organic, and that sort of thing. Have you
Mhm.
seen any unique styles of how to deal with weeds, particularly from like the organic point of view? Because obviously, they have a restriction on what chemicals they're allowed to use. And I'm assuming that manual labor is not
Yeah.
necessarily.
So for rice, managing weeds. Oh, sorry. I think it cut out for hear me. I'm
Oh
sorry.
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, wait. I missed the second half of your question.
No,
I
I was just saying, have you heard anything interesting from different types of growers on how to handle their weeds besides like, like we talked about chemicals and the water flooding and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So I mean, there's not that many ways to manage weeds, right? So
Mm.
we can manage weeds either by using chemicals. And rice, we have water management. In other crops, we do also use water management. So, like for example, with tomatoes, they use drip irrigation, right? So you're getting only your tomatoes and not the weeds, right? So the point of that is partially weed management as well as water conservation.
Mm.
So there's a lot of things that we call them cultural controls, right? So ways that we manipulate our management practices. Crop rotation is a big one, right? So rotating crops means that you're able to suppress some of those weed species because different crops compete with weeds differently.
Mm-hmm.
So crop rotation is a big one. Fallowing fields is another big one that growers, especially organic growers, would use. So leaving the fields out of production for a year, maybe two. Tillage, so either by hand or by machines if possible. So many different ways to manage weeds, but none of them is ever 100%. Even herbicides are not 100% control usually in most cases,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we use sort of what we think of as I think I can't remember the weed scientist that said it, but the idea is to use many little hammers. So you're not using just one weed control method; you're using multiple different weed control methods,
Mm-hmm.
so that the weeds don't become tolerant to any of those particular methods.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. That way, yeah, you're kind of switching it up each time. We do the same thing with pest control. That way
Yeah,
they don't get
exactly.
used to one method and get they can almost like adapt to it.
Hmm.
So with that, I forgot what my question was going to be now. I had another question ready and I forgot what it was.
But that's okay.
I remember what it was. So I'm not sure if you've seen this much in the northern parts of California or in other parts, but in the Central Valley, we're starting to see a shift towards more regenerative practices of agriculture, like no-till and preservation of soil and that sort of thing. Has that impacted the rate of weeds and the strength of weeds or that sort of? Have you seen anything like that show up over in your area?
Sure. So I guess when you go to like a no-till method in particular,
Mm-hmm.
um, it can have impacts on the weed community, right? So most of the weeds are coming up from, say, the like top 6 inches of soil,
Mm-hmm.
right? So when you disturb the soil by tilling, you're bringing up more weed seeds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're doing no-till, to some extent, you're not going to get any weeds coming up from deeper than 6 inches, right? So most everything's just coming up from that top 6 inches of soil. Um, so it can have some suppression effect, but then it can also end up with actually selecting or like turning your weed population more towards annual weeds. So weeds that, or sorry, not annual weeds, perennial weeds. So you'd be shifting away from annual weeds to more perennial weeds because you're
Mm-hmm.
not disturbing the soil every year. So you can end up with weeds that are much bigger in some cases and harder to actually get out of the ground, that are sort of resistant, so to speak, to tillage. So there's with anything in agriculture, you move one thing or you change one thing and you create a different problem,
Yeah,
right? So
that
it's
seems
never
to be.
it's never super black and white. I'd say like you do one thing and it shifts to creating another issue. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why I mean when I think about pest management in general, I'm always thinking about like how can we do again like sort of many little different things.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we do no till, but then we try to use cover cropping, or we you know maybe are using like Roundup Ready crops. That was why Roundup Ready became so popular, was because of low tillage or zero tillage.
Mm-hmm.
So trade-offs. Sort of
Yeah,
whatever you choose to do, you have trade-offs in other areas.
right. Yeah, no, that seems to be the motto of agriculture is you fix one problem, but then you have 10 more that pop up
Yeah,
because of it.
exactly.
So just
And
gotta.
sometimes it's hard to predict, so sometimes we
Mhm.
think we have a good grasp on what will happen, and then we're surprised,
Right.
or a new pest is introduced, or some new issue happens like wildfires or something. There's a bunch of things outside of our control, or not enough rain, or too much rain, or
Hmm.
so.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's always a constant battle of trying to, and like you said, you can never predict what's going to happen next. So it's impossible to know what's going to work right now and if it's going to continue to work for as long as we need it to work before we can find another solution, pretty much.
Yes, exactly. But yeah, I would say regenerative ag is a big topic, I'd say, across the state right now. Trying to, do more soil conservation practices. It's a little bit different in rice just because of our soil type. And so I would say folks aren't really shifting to no-till. We've done research on in that particular area, but it
Mm.
hasn't been widely adopted. Our soils are very heavy clay soils, and so they don't lend themselves super well to low tillage or no tillage. I do advocate for it in some cases with certain weed species, just because continuously tilling them under actually can sometimes lengthen the amount of time you have those weeds in your soil.
Mm.
So it's kind of site specific and weed specific, but yeah, I think regenerative ag, generally speaking, is a very important topic across the state right now.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's definitely, and because it's such a new, a new thing to the table for agriculture, I think it's kind of getting a lot of attention because nobody really knows what to do with it yet. But I think it definitely has some pros and cons across the table. But like you said, it's with everything agriculture, everything's very circumstantial. It has to fit your situation and your operation size and your methods and all that sort of stuff as well.
Yeah, and I think too, like as an extension scientist, one of the things that I talk about a lot is like it has to make sense economically,
Mm,
right? So regardless of how great it is research wise, you know, if it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint, you know, farming is a business, and
right.
so if it doesn't make sense to the grower, it's just not going to make sense, you know.
Yeah.
So it has to. In the end, it's all about, you know, are they able to adopt this practice? Does it help save money in the short term or the long term? If
Mm,
it doesn't, then it may not be widely adopted.
yeah. No, and that's definitely a
That
good
makes
point.
sense, right? It makes sense.
Yeah. No, that's definitely a good point too. Is, like you said, agriculture above all is, it is a business. So, if you can come up with the best solution in the world, but if nobody can afford it, then it's probably not that good of a solution after all.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
yeah. No, absolutely. So, I think kind of shifting into the next question I had, this is a little bit not off topic, but it's a little bit changing gears.
Sure.
So you obviously work with rice and you work with weeds on on all different scales. How many different industries or different types of growers do you actually work with?
So my official like job description, I cover 4 counties
Hmm.
technically. So I cover Yuba, Sutter, Placer, and Sacramento counties.
Hmm.
Um, but I do tend to work in sort of all the rice growing counties.
Hmm.
Um, there are only 2 of us that work as rice advisors up in this area. So myself and my colleague Luis Espino works out of Butte County. So he's an entomologist, and so the 2 of us sort of work together. So often, if there's like a weed management call or something in a county that I don't technically cover, I might still go to that or talk to that grower or talk to that pest control advisor.
Hmm.
So, I mean, I cover 4 counties specifically, but often I end up working in all 9 of our rice growing counties. And
Wow.
then I also work a lot with our industry. So, you know, I all of the advisors give talks at CAPCA and talks at PAPA. So there's a lot of interaction with us in the industry. I collaborate a lot with different companies. If they're bringing new products to California, we'll participate in testing those products.
Hmm.
Um, and then of course with like the university. So I'm part of University of California, but not part of UC Davis. But I collaborate a lot with UC Davis. And then up here, since I'm based out of sort of the northern part of the state, I also work a lot with Chico State. So I teach at Chico State sometimes. I do guest lecturing. I have Chico State students work with me a lot. Um, and then even the community colleges, Butte College in particular. So there's a lot of collaboration because we're county based.
Hmm.
So it's a little bit different than working like in a university setting. So most of my work is with the community, and then
Hmm.
of course extension itself. We also have different programs under us. So we've got 4-H, Master Gardeners. So I do a lot of work as well with our 4-H advisors, collaborating with them with our Master Gardener program, training Master Gardeners. So it's a little bit different than being based at a university,
Hmm.
and I love it actually. My
I hope
favorite
so.
part of my job is being able to talk to lots of different people, go to different places, uh, and work actually with lots of different types of people. So I am working primarily with growers and pest control advisors. That's my primary clientele, but I also get to do a lot of work with students, of course, and then with the community. So
Hmm.
it's a little bit different
Yeah, it definitely
than
sounds like it.
being a professor. Yeah. And it is, I think most of us, if you talk to a lot of the extension specialists or advisors, you'd hear that most of us really enjoy this part of our job as the outreach and the talking to the public. And I talk to the public too, so I do a lot of if I'm invited to schools and stuff, I speak in classrooms.
Hmm.
So elementary schools, middle schools, high schools. I've done garden clubs, so there's a lot of public outreach.
Hmm. Yeah, it definitely sounds like it. And I was actually going to transition that point into another point. I've got a couple extensions fairly close to me. I've talked to soil scientists at one extension, and we have a citrus extension not too far that does a citrus tasting thing in
Okay.
December
Yeah.
over with UC Riverside. and I actually got to tour their facility and see a lot of their labs and see what they're working on and that kind of stuff. It was really interesting because I'm kind of a citrus nerd.
Okay.
So they do a lot of their community outreach by having people come to their labs, and they do, you know, demonstrations of stuff. And like I said, they do the citrus tasting thing, and they show different varieties of citrus that we don't grow in California. What kind of, you know, like I know you talked about, you do a lot of outreach stuff in terms of going to classrooms and teaching and that sort of stuff. What kind of community work would you do through your extension?
So I mean, with the growers and PCAs themselves, I actually go to their fields, so that
Mm.
they'll call me up and I and say like I have X problem and
Hmm.
I want you to see something, and so I go to their fields. So I spend a lot of time during the rice season actually visiting with individual growers and
Mm.
pest control advisors. So in fact, almost every day this summer. Maybe because people were, you know, wanting to get out and do things, there's not a lot of activities.
Hmm. Yeah,
So everyone
exactly.
was out looking at their fields more. I'm not sure, but yeah. So that's one of my big things, and one of all of the advisors
Hmm.
do a lot of that is what we call farm calls. So we're, you know, directly connecting them to the university, and able to, you know, if I don't know the answer to the question, I can, you know, shoot it out to my colleagues.
Mm.
So that's probably the biggest component. And then we also do field days. We do, you know, seminars, and right now webinars, since we can't do in-person seminars. So a lot of that. And then I do a lot of writing. So we have blog, we have social media. We do, I write articles for some of the extension magazines. So like Capca magazine, the Farm Bureau, their Ag Alert. So there's a lot of sort of crossing of all of us. We, you know, we work for the university, but then we're also doing a lot of extension and outreach in other
Mm.
areas.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds really cool. So obviously, you know, with this podcast, we focus on ag literacy and kind of bringing people who don't know as much about agriculture onto the show and talking to them about different aspects of the industry they tend to not know about. I actually have met
Sure.
quite a few people that don't even realize that agricultural education is an option in the United States. Um,
Yes.
have you interacted with a lot of people of that, you know, background of not having much or really any agricultural experience or knowledge? And if so, what have you, you know, what is some, like, what are some questions that you've gotten? What are things that they were surprised by? What have you interacted with them about?
So I'd say like, so I do teach at Chico State. So a lot of my students, I teach a plant science introductory course with a couple of their professors. So a lot of our students are very new to agriculture and have
Mm-hmm.
never, you know, even maybe in some cases seen a farm or garden ever. So we spend a lot of time just sort of, you know, getting people used to the idea of like touching the soil. You know, we do little garden plots with them so that they can grow their own vegetables to eat at the end of the semester. Just very basic stuff. When I talk to, you know, people outside of Chico State, outside of my students, I spend a lot of time sort of, I would say, dispelling myths. You know, there's a lot of people that don't realize that we grow a lot of these crops here in California. Like, for example, most people don't know that almonds and walnuts are, you know, pretty much just grown here in California. We don't grow them in other places in the US.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, that California is a big dairy producer. So there's a lot of, I spend a lot of time sort of just, yeah, explaining a lot about California agriculture. And sort of how important it is both to the state and to the United States as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we produce a lot of vegetables here, you know, not as or that are not as widely grown in the rest of the U.S. So I would say that's probably the biggest thing is dispelling myths, and then also I think folks don't realize, uh, you know, the in some cases that they live so close to farms. Right. So, you know, when I speak to kids, like I do a lot of speaking in Yuba City schools, and even though it's an agricultural community, a lot of the kids haven't ever visited a farm. So I've done some partnership with some of our after school programs so that kids can taste rice, and then I talk about rice and I show them rice plants and I bring plants with me to class. So I think just a lot of trying to expose people to things that are so close to us, yet it's sometimes so far, right? So we do like ag tours as well. There's some of the like Butte County does a agricultural tour that people can sign up for, and then they get bussed around. Obviously not right now, but normally, so they get bussed around to different agribusinesses. Yeah, so just a lot of different different things, I guess.
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool. It sounds like you have quite a bit of interaction with a lot of different types of people.
Yeah, I like to think of myself as sort of an extension, as sort of like a bridge between agriculture and everybody else, because we are scientists. We are, we do have that distinction, I guess, of being a scientist. And so I can speak with some authority, and people do listen. So I try to sort of be an advocate, right? An advocate for ag.
Advocate, yeah.
So I think a lot of us do that, both in our personal lives and also in maybe through social media or other outreach that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been trying to, that's kind of the purpose of this podcast, is to try to be that bridge between agriculture and the consumer, and, try to show the consumer that agriculture is not so far out, and show the agriculture that the consumer is not so lost, that we can actually have these conversations and people will actually enjoy them. And so it's nice to see that the extensions are doing, doing their part in bridging that gap as well. Because a lot of people don't realize how scientific agriculture can get. It's very precise, scientific work that people are doing to make sure that their food is safe and is grown correctly and grown in the best way possible. And people tend to not realize how much work goes into it.
Yeah, and actually as well, I would say that the growers and the pest control advisors are very well educated. I mean, they attend, our webinars and seminars and field days and things. So they, probably in some cases more than the general public are exposed to graphs and numbers and data like on a very regular basis. So I think a lot of people would be surprised by that, right? That our growers and our PCAs are pretty much, all year attending these seminars. And I don't think the general public actually does that often.
Yeah, no, a lot of people I've talked to, because I've had quite a few people on here that are definitely not from agricultural backgrounds, because they have questions, and I bring them on here to ask those questions. We can have conversations about them. A lot of them don't realize just how educated farmers tend to be. Growers are extremely, they know their stuff, and I would hope that they do. If they're being tasked with growing this much food for such a large population, I would hope that they're at least educated on how to actually grow it. And that tends to be a topic that a lot of people don't think about quite as much in their daily lives. But as soon as you bring it up to them, they're like, "Oh yeah, I guess that makes sense." I would hope that they know a lot too.
Yeah, and I think too, people also forget, just in terms of like, I guess, perceptions about farming and about growers, that they don't want to destroy the land. Like, the land is very important to them, right? They're in it to preserve the land. They want to be able to farm for as long as possible. So a lot of these practices and sort of agroecological things that we talk about, the growers are just as gung-ho about doing them as the general public. It's just that they're coming from maybe a perspective of like, I've tried this before and it didn't work, or
right.
So there's, they have more knowledge about it than the general public. So I always try to bring that up. They've been living in the land, they farm, they're very knowledgeable about the systems that they work in.
Right. No, exactly. I think that's a good way of putting it too, is that, that land is their livelihood, essentially. If that goes down, then they're kind of up a creek at that point. So it's important that they preserve that land more than anybody, really. So it's good to keep in mind that they're looking out for the best interest of the land, of the consumer, of the farmer themselves and their family, and that they're just trying to do their best to make sure everyone gets fed on time.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, I appreciate very much our growers. Like, there's only a very small percentage of the population anymore that farms, and I think it's 2%, right, in the U.S., something like that. And the rest of us that don't work 100% of the time in agriculture, I mean, very much benefit from that, right? It allows the rest of us to do the other things that we enjoy doing. Otherwise, we would all be back farming like we were about 100 years ago. So I always talk about that as how important it is that we have people that are still farming, and that we're able to, produce more food, so that I can have my my iPhone or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Right, all the things that I can do that I wouldn't be able to do otherwise.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I'd be farming, pretty much most of the year myself as well. So
Right. No, exactly. And that's why whenever, whenever I have conversations with people about, large farms, or people are worried about farmers getting, just like capitalizing on it, and they're like, well, why can't I be a farmer? I was like, do you really want to be a farmer? Like, I don't think you realize.
hard work, yeah, super hard work.
Yeah. So no, I'm always very adamant about people understanding just how good they have it when there's people out there, working 24 hours a day, making sure that their food is safe and healthy and abundant. And yeah, so that's actually the inspiration for the closing line of this podcast, which is always, don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.
That's right.
So
That's right.
yeah, so I think that those are all the questions I had. Did you have anything else you wanted to add or throw in there? Or
I would just say, for folks that are interested in learning more about agriculture, there are extension offices in every county in California. So, any kid can be involved in 4-H. 4-H does a lot of science education. It's not just about ag, it's about science in general.
Mhm.
And then, of course, if you're interested in gardening and want to do it on a small scale in your backyard or in your front yard or whatever land you have, the master gardeners are available in every county and are ready to help answer any questions for folks that are starting out gardening. So, you don't have to be a farmer to be involved in ag. I think everybody should be involved in ag and know more about where their food comes from.
I couldn't agree more. So if you have anything that you would like to share, you have my information, so you can always let me know. If you have any social media that you'd like to share, I can put that down in the description if you want anyone to contact you or anything like that. If not, you want to stay anonymous, that's fine by me.
Oh no, I'll put my social media out there. It's okay.
Okay. So yeah, you can tag, you can share that now if you like, or if you want, I'll just put it down in the description, or I'll do both. Either way, it's up to you.
Oh sure. I mean, so the rice team we have our own social media, and I believe it's at UC Rice on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And then me myself, I have my own personal Instagram, which is at Scientist Cali, and that's where I kind of share more things about California ag in general, and maybe just agriculture in general, not just about rice.
No, there's definitely a lot of good stuff on there. I was browsing your page a little bit before we started this episode. There's
okay, well, good.
Yeah, and that's actually the page that she contacted me through, so I know that it's a good one. So I'll be sharing that around. I'll put that in my description below and everything. I'll make sure to tag, whenever this episode goes out, I'll make sure to tag you and everything, that people can find you and reach out and learn more about what you do. So
okay, sounds good. Thank you so much, Brendan. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. I had a great, I think it was a great talk. I think people learned quite a bit, hopefully. And if we have anybody asking any questions, I'll be sure to send them your way.
Okay, sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, and thank you everyone for tuning in. And don't forget, if you ate today, thank a farmer.